Good evening. I'm Kelly Wright. Thanks for joining me as we spend the next hour together. And from my home to your home, we are wishing that you are safe and well, taking care of yourself and your family because you matter. My opening observations tonight, faith in tough times. Look, let's face it, we've got some difficult days ahead. We're going through wildfires on the West Coast. They're historic in nature right now. We also have this COVID-19 pandemic totaling now more than 190,000 deaths from coronavirus. And then we have the racial unrest, the racial divide, the political division in the midst of a presidential campaign that will get more vitriolic as the days loom large for the election on November 3rd. So the bottom line is this: when we're going through these tough times, it's important for each and every one of us to understand that tough times don't last, but tough people do. And in the midst of us having some steely resolve and determination, we must understand what Scripture states: be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. The bottom line, my friends, I'm so glad that trouble don't last always. And someday this will end. This trouble shall pass. But in the meantime, we've got to continue to fight the good fight and stir up good trouble. And those are my opening observations. So there's a lot going on today politically around this country and racially. So two men from my West Coast connection are joining me now. They're political analysts and very astute attorneys. Mark Harris, civil rights attorney for the Ben Crump Law Firm, a partner with that firm in Sacramento. And then Timothy Allen Simon, also an attorney, owner of TAS Strategies, and the chairman of the board of directors for the California Black Chamber of Commerce. And formerly, he served with Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. So, gentlemen, before I get started into the political mainstream, I want to talk about what's happening in California because it's in your backyard. These historic wildfires, and politically, I guess one could argue if there's ever a time to talk about climate change, it's likely that it would be now. Timothy, you once served on the utilities board. Tell me about it.
Well, when I was on the California Public Utilities Commission, I began to notice, I think what most Californians did, and that was the fire seasons, which historically had been centered around Southern California because of the Santa Ana winds that ramp up in the fall. That fire season was getting increasingly longer. Longer due to a combination of drought conditions and then deluges of rain, creating an enormous amount of fuel, and then climate change. The fact that we are noticing a warming of the planet, a warming of California. I think the debate comes down to how much is man contributing in CO2 or carbon is contributing to that level of rise. I don't argue with the science. I go with the science. But yes, California has a very difficult dilemma to deal with. The other factor that you have in terms of the threat to human life and property was the flight from the cities into the rural areas that have largely become suburban rural. And believe it or not, there's a racial component to that. But that's the challenge that we now have. As Mark and I know, in the law, it's called coming to the nuisance, and where people are moving to or have moved to areas that are under the threat of wildfires. You're not under the threat of wildfires if you live in central Los Angeles or San Francisco. But the fact that we've expanded into these areas that abut green belts have created a greater risk to, most importantly, human life, but property as well.
Well, to both of you who live in that area and you're faced with this air quality index that is not very healthy, Mark, how difficult has it been to maneuver through that and maintain some modicum of living and healthy living, I should point out?
It hasn't been easy at all, Kelly. I can only speak as a non-expert, regular, person. And there are a couple of things. In Sacramento, it's no longer in our backyard. It's in our front yard. It's in our backyard. It permeates our households. I'm an outdoors guy. I go outside every day of my life. I ride a bike, I jog, I play golf, I swim. For the past 4 weeks in California, due to the extreme heat and the fires, I literally have not been able to stay outside for much longer than 5 or 10 minutes at a time. Timothy and I and all the 40 million of us in California are really going through some things. I know that there are times when the rest of the country kind of smiles at California, the land of fruit and nuts, as Jerry Brown once described us. But we really are suffering here, folks. This air quality we have to wake up now and check the air quality index every day, Kelly. Literally, my household wakes up and checks. I didn't know, quite honestly, that an AQI even existed before all this happened. Thomas Friedman, the great journalist with the New York Times, said, this isn't just global warming, this is global weirding, where you have whole towns burned down. The town of Paradise, California, burned down in its entirety. This is apocalyptic.
Gentlemen, when we come back, I want to talk about what's happening in Rochester, in particular, the police chief there going into an early retirement in the wake of the death of Daniel Prude and the revelations of that. That and more when we come back. Welcome back to the program. So we're talking all things politically right now with my good friends from the West Coast, attorneys Mark Harris and Timothy Allen Simon, also a very astute political analysts as well. Gentlemen, we were talking in the first part about the fires. My prayers are out there with you, for all of you in California dealing with these fires. But there's also another fire that's brewing in this country, and it's the fire of racial unrest. And it's spilled over into violence in some places. We've seen it in Portland. We've seen it in Kenosha. We've seen it in Minneapolis, and Washington, D.C., and Brooklyn, New York, and Rochester, New York. The birthplace, if you will, of Frederick Douglass launching his newspaper, the North Star, back in the 1800s. And here we are on the cusp of what happened, in the wake of what happened to Daniel Prude, dying at the hands of police officers treating him inhumanely. Social workers could have been called in, medical workers could have been called in, but the police were there, and the consequences is that he died 7 days later. In the wake of that, we have now seen everything get to a point where the police chief has gone into early retirement along with other commanders, or the reassignment of those commanders. What do you think is going on there on the ground? We've seen the mayor come out and actually apologize for it. And one of the things she said, Mark, she said the system failed Daniel Prude. And for that, she is sorry that it happened.
It's a sad reality. African-American female mayor in Rochester, African-American male police chief who spent his entire policing career with that police department. This isn't a black-white thing when it comes to policing, when it comes to governance. This is a failure. Again, we talked about the failure earlier relative to climate change and relative to the fires and relative to COVID eradication. This is an ongoing 400 years of oppression. Mr. Prude was murdered, it's plain and simple. He was suffocated. He was able to live on life support for 7 days. He had a bag placed over his head. They call it colloquially a spit mask. Kelly, I had a very celebrated case here in Sacramento, California, involving an 11-year-old child who had one of those spit masks put over his head. He was handcuffed and he was put in the cement right here in Sacramento. And the entire nation reacted when they saw the video. What we need is to acknowledge that it's not one bad apple, it's a bad orchard. The business of policing needs to change in this country. And this is yet another example vividly brought to us, thank God, with police body cam 5 months after the fact, but finally brought to light. Something's wrong with the institution of policing.
And here we are again, gentlemen. We've been talking about this over and over again. Before I leave you, the solutions are clear. But the one thing that seems to be lacking is the will of the American people and the people's house, the members of Congress who represent us, and the will of the president to really work together to get this resolved. Why are we dealing with this at a time when more lives are dying, and at a time when that's causing disruption and destruction in our communities, the time is now. The time is
You know,
now to make a change.
one of the things, Kelly, that's so disturbing about this is that Mr. Prude's family called the police in this situation. They thought they were doing the right thing. How many stories do we have to have of African American families who call the police in the hope of providing some level of assistance for a family member? I never see these stories involving Caucasian folks. I never see them, quite honestly, involving any other ethnicity, including Latinos or Asian Americans, not indigenous people. These stories, time after time after time, are Black. This is a Black-white issue. And we have to accept that, we have to admit that, and we have to demand a change in policing. Policing, as Commissioner Simon said, has been the same in this country for several centuries. The most disturbing part of this, besides the fact that they murdered this man, is the fact that they sat around and laughed. They kicked him. They laughed over the fact that he vomited within the mask that was placed over his face. They waited those 3 minutes you talked about as they were sitting around kicking his naked body in a snow flurry. This is inhumane behavior. None of those officers should ever be back on the street. And we as a citizenry have to demand more of law enforcement and of our government.
You know, Kelly, I have a cousin who served in Vietnam who suffers from PTSD. And he's been institutionalized, and the family has tried, our family has tried the best to meet his needs. And I remember once talking to his sister, my cousin, about this dilemma, because he had been calling me when he was institutionalized seeking my representation. She said, Timothy, and this is before George Floyd, this is before Mr. Prude, long before. She said, Timothy, there were occasions that we needed to call the police, but we knew that when they arrived, they would kill him. And you have many families out there that are battling with mental illness in their families. Many of these people, veterans, but even if they're not veterans, in terms of African Americans, we know where that PTSD originally comes from in terms of our history in this nation. And literally people are afraid to call the peace officers in fear that their loved one that needs help will be murdered. And that is something that has to change. These men and women who are trained to kill, in many cases licensed to kill, do not often need to make these calls. Cities have to find, and by the way, I think police unions have a role here. And by the way, I think my so-called conservative Republican colleagues have a role here. You preach about your concern about the overreaching power of government, but you're silent. They're crickets when that same government annihilates its citizens that look like us. So I think there has to be a multitude of organizations that come to the table and understand that this system has to be changed, or we'll continue to see the type of unrest that we're seeing in this country. And clearly we have a president that's fueling the unrest. You know, once upon a time, a president came forward and sought peace, pled to the nation to find a higher road. We have a president that has said, no, I'm gonna side with the people that are showing up at the rallies with guns and that are trying to enforce, you know, my philosophy. That's unacceptable.
Gentlemen, I'm have to leave it there, but Timothy Allen Simon, Mark Harris, attorneys et al., esquires, and men who represent their community very well. I appreciate your comments today and your insights. Obviously, we'll be talking about this a lot more until a change comes. Thank you for being part of this program. We'll be back next to talk about violence and how we cure it with violence interrupters out on the streets quite a bit to step in and stop the violence that happens in our Black and brown communities. That's next. And welcome back to the program. So joining me now is Marcus McAllister. He is known as a violence interrupter for Cure Violence Global. We've had Cure Violence on this program before, and for those of you who may or may not know, let me update you. Cure Violence is a program that treats violence as a public health epidemic. And indeed, that's what it is. But in the midst of this epidemic, Marcus, we also find ourselves dealing with the pandemic of COVID-19. And your organization, Cure Violence Global, has actively engaged in helping people understand how we safeguard our Black and brown communities that are dealing with violence, but also how we safeguard them from the pandemic. How have you been involved in that, and how great of a task is that?
Oh well, it's been a large task, and I would say not only has it been a large task, it's been something to be expected by the way how we look at violence. Meaning, there's been a rise throughout the country, and obviously there's been more incidents that have not been interrupted that have caused more outrage and whatever that may be. And so, us looking at violence from a health perspective, it didn't shock us that things were going to go up because more people are exposed. And the more you're exposed to violence, the way we look at it as a pandemic itself, the more you are going to be violent. So here we have a civil unrest going on in the country. You have a pandemic, and we had violence before those two things compounded some of these communities that we work in. But we've been able to navigate the waters. It was a little different at first because of the pandemic, but now I think many cities are starting to get a handle and being able to apply the approach.
You know, I like the way you put that, a big infusion of understanding in this country. And yet, Marcus, you'd have to agree that we have a big infusion of confusion. How do we deal with the pandemic? How do we deal with violence, Black on Black violence, and then the issue of the distrust between police and the Black community because of the violence that we've seen police carry out against Black lives. Daniel Prude, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta, and how can we forget George Floyd? And yet we find ourselves in this embroiled in this difficult time right now in our country. From your perspective, how are you seeing this, and how can you address this through Cure Violence?
Well, I think, and rest in peace to all those that lost their lives to the violence, and you just mentioned there through the hands of police and different things that happen. And I look at it like this, that we are an outlet of paying attention to things that necessarily don't call for police to be in that situation. So even with the situation with George Floyd and the money, and if you had like in Minnesota now is looking at doing this particular approach and adding it to their city, if you had like a program, and I even think about even the situation with Nipsey Hussle, and I just think about different situations that have happened when you have people that are working that particular neighborhood. And I like to call them like, we pay attention to disrespect, right? I've always used this, that the police they're not paid to pay attention to disrespect. And they're not trained to that. And that's not what they're in pros for, that they're there for. But we understand that disrespect leads to a homicide. Like, it leads to things happening. And when you have a program, a model approach where individuals are trained to pay attention to disrespect and different things that happen at the spur of the moment in these communities, and not looking at it like, well, nothing's happened yet, people move on. See, the Cure Violence approach, the workers, the violence, they don't move on. They pay attention. They say 2 + 2 = 4. So we need to pay attention to this situation before it becomes a forest fire, before it gets out of hand. And that's probably as simple as I can put it. The difference between having police monitor a neighborhood compared to having interrupters and outreach workers pay attention to things and be able to stop them before they get out of control. Because it's like, you don't want to be a person that responds after the fact. You want to try to stop things in the beginning before it became something that lost many lives due to I ain't gonna say simple, but just something that started out small that became a big forest fire because no one put water on the little lighter type fire that was on the ground at the time.
Talking to Marcus McAllister, when we return, we'll talk to him about his own life and why he does what he does, and that's getting out there in the streets to help save lives. Back with more after this. And welcome back. I'm talking to Marcus McAllister. He is known as a violence interrupter. I know him as, in my personal opinion, as one of the many heroes and sheroes who are out there on the streets, on the front lines, not only dealing with COVID-19 pandemic, but also dealing with the epidemic of gun violence inflicted within our communities. in a disproportionate way. And Marcus, you know, Black Lives Matter, and sometimes when you talk about the argument Black Lives Matter, people get upset when you say, well, it's not just a police and black thing, it's also a black on black thing. You know, we're all our brothers and sisters keepers, and hopefully not our killers. And you're right there in Chicago, and you've gone to other cities, putting your own life on the line as your brothers and sisters do, to save lives and to stop the violence from erupting to a point where someone's killed, someone's shot. And let us not forget what's happened in Chicago with the murder rate going up, 1-year-old child being killed, others being killed, and not a large protest in retaliation to that. How does that impact your work, or are you able to keep it going?
Well, I mean, the answer to that, I have to answer it on two sides. Because on the personal side, I've been doing this work now going on 17 years. And so going on 17 years from when I first started out doing this work, obviously from then to now, there's been a lot of things that's happened in our country that rightfully so deserve outrage, deserves change. And I'm proud of where we are now as people have had enough, right? And so I support that, and I'm with that. But over time of going that long a stretch, obviously I've marched personally as Cure Violence, or back when we were called Ceasefire, to shootings that happened many times in the neighborhoods that we were in, whether it be Chicagoland or another city, and just marching in protest of people being killed, as you mentioned earlier, from black on black, one another, you know, in a community. So I've always been a little conflicted with just the fact that I wish we always had tremendous outrage no matter what, as you just mentioned. I wish that many cities would go crazy when one-year-old gets shot in any city, when anyone for that matter. But when you see these kids getting shot, yeah, I would love to see that same level of you know, outrage that goes with the other. And I'm not both are needed. So I found myself looking at it from that standpoint. But nevertheless, it doesn't stop the work. From the cities that are doing this work, we know that not only do we have to pay attention to that, there's still things that we have to pay attention to in our neighborhood. And our teams that are doing the work in these different cities, they don't have time to take off because of what's happening in the world news attention, right? They don't get to take a day off just for that, because their job is consumed with other things that are happening daily in their neighborhoods of violence, beyond just one particular type of violence.
You know, if Cure Violence wasn't actively caring for people in the hood, it could be substantially worse. Is that the way you look at this?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, it could be a lot worse. And, you know, I remember we were meeting with the mayor of Jacksonville, Florida, and we had just started the program in Jacksonville. And they have 2 sites that are Cure Violence sites there, Mayor Lenny Curry. And so they initially, when we met to go after like 6 months of the program being launched, they were expecting that there should be like a 30-40% reduction, because there has been in many cities. And I'm sure in my presentation, I mentioned that that's possible. Well, we didn't have a reduction it actually was like the 4-month mark, because first 2 months were still a bunch of hiring and they counted those months. But with a team on the ground, 4 months, they hadn't seen a decline. But what I can say is this, is that once we had all our data, so we handed over to the mayor the data that showed how many mediations that the teams had did in these 2 sites in Jacksonville, Florida. And they had did like 150 something mediations. And so although the numbers didn't decline, they didn't go up either, just the mediations alone that the interrupters had prevented, who knows how many could have came out of 150 mediations. Even if it was 25 homicides out of 150, that's a tremendous decline in what the number could have been. So I think that there's so much that goes into it when interrupters are in these different communities and are putting out fires of all sorts. And like you mentioned, the question you asked me was, this thing it could be worse if you didn't have programs on the ground doing the work that they're doing. And even the COVID stuff. I mean, we've adapted in different cities. They're helping with social distancing, helping with the you know, putting out the pub ed educate people, because the staff, they have the relationship with the neighborhood. So who is the neighborhood going to listen to more so? The news? Or are they going to listen to people out there that try to at least guide them in the direction and say, hey, put on a mask, hey, let's, the different things. So we have sites that have engaged in that work and have been a big help to even helping the numbers go down in their respective neighborhoods because of their relationship to educate a neighborhood community.
Incredible work that's going on. I'm talking to Marcus McAllister. We'll be back with more, Marcus, right after this. And welcome back. Marcus McAllister is the gentleman I'm talking to. He's a member of Cure Violence Global, an incredible organization that actually goes into the streets to deal with violence, viewing it as a public health crisis. And therefore, they treat it in such a way as one would treat COVID-19. You put people on the front lines to engage with the disease and try to save lives. And that's exactly what you've been doing for, 17 years now, Marcus. How did you get involved in this? What compelled you to do this?
Well, that's a great question, because and I'm going to do my best just to put it into a simple answer, because myself, before this work, after coming home from jail, I was mostly trying to find something to do and find a job, being a felon and different things of that nature. I found myself falling back into the streets, and something I said I would never do again after receiving a 10-year sentence in the federal system. And so I started to put my feet back into the streets and do certain things, and things that could have led to my death, others' death, violence, a plethora of things in that nature. But along came this job opportunity. A lady who actually goes to my church, and she worked at a recreation center that was considering, she was the one of the board presidents, was considering adapting this new approach to violence called ceasefire at the time. And she approached me one day and just asked me, would I be interested in hearing about this approach? And I basically said, I wouldn't mind hearing about it. What is it? She told me a little bit about what this work was. And when she told me about it, I thought it was very ironic, because she approached me my family has a sign company. My grandfather, rest in peace, started a sign company years ago. And so my family always did signs. And so at this time, I couldn't find a job. I never liked doing signs. I was trying to work at my family business. So I thought it was strange that she asked me, was I looking for a job inside a job that had my name on the building, that had McAllister Sign Company. And me being a spiritual person, I looked at that as something like, what is going on here? And then when I found out what the work was about, and I found that it wasn't a neighborhood watch, because I wasn't interested in, I thought I didn't want this. I'm still one leg was in the streets, and I'm not going to be a police thing. And so they explained to me what the program was about, and I gave it a shot, and it really saved my life. I mean, it stopped me from going back to jail. It stopped me from getting myself killed. And I started to give a lot of myself to a community by doing this work. And who would have thought, I'm a firm believer in the Bible. I think it's Ephesians 3:20. It talks about how God will bless you exceedingly and abundantly, more than you can ever think or ask. It's a scripture I like to apply to this, because I never once imagined that I would be doing this work. I never asked to do it. It wasn't something that I thought about. But it's blessed me more than I ever could have imagined to find myself doing this work and traveling. You mentioned out the country. I mean, I've been blessed to be able to travel throughout the world. I've been to Africa. I've been to the West Bank and Trinidad, and Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and I've been all over Canada. And it's been something. I was in Africa in a church one time, visiting the site there in Africa in Cape Town. And the guy that runs it is a pastor by the name of Pastor Craven. And I was there on a Sunday. I just happened to be there for 3 weeks, and we were checking on the site. And so I went to church with his church that particular Sunday, and he ministered and said some things over my life. And I have a recording of it, and I thought it was great. He said, he was just saying, if any man says that he doesn't have a gift in him, he is a lie, because God gives everyone a gift. And he said, I bet you Marcus didn't think that he would be traveling the world, being able to help people and deal with mayors and governors and delegations. And I found myself at the United Nations one time with Dr. Sluckin. I couldn't believe it. I mean, just the trail of places that God has taken me in this work, I'm forever indebted, because I always say in the trainings when we train the violence interrupters, I say this. I say that, the work changed me, so it allows me to change other people. So I'm fortunate to see how it changes all these interrupters throughout the country, and it becomes like a ripple effect because now their lives are changed, and it has to be something special. Because if I worked at Jiffy Lube, and no disrespect to Jiffy Lube or any other business, and they could pay me $75 an hour, Kelly, I would be lying, Mr. Wright, if I said that just because I'm working at Jiffy Lube, making that amount of money, that I'm not susceptible to messing up, because I don't care about the franchise of a Jiffy Lube. But when you come into a program like a Cure Violence, that's more than just a paycheck, it's more than just a job, and it's more than you don't want to mess up. I didn't want to mess up with this work. So I said, I finally found something that stopped me from going down different paths. And I looked at that as God blessing me. The Bible said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they should be called the children of God. I got into this work so it could bless me, and then I could bless others. It wasn't like I just said, let me get in it to save lives. It was saving my life. Glory to God. And that's kind of how I look at what it's doing for a lot of workers in this country. And I hear the stories all the time.
Your faith speaks well, and it encourages you. And I think for those who are watching, it may encourage others as well, because when you're facing guns and people shooting each other, and you're standing in between that to stop people from even getting to a point where it escalates to that kind of violence, you need something more than just your wits. You need something more than just your knowledge. You're going to need some faith, and you have faith under fire. When I come back, I'll continue my dialogue with Marcus McAllister, violence interrupter, a man of faith, a man of substance, actually dealing with violence on the streets like nobody else. That's what violence interrupters do with Cure Violence. Back with more after this. So welcome back to the program. So the reason why I'm talking about Cure Violence is because we do need a cure violence. We need to have a ceasefire between police and members of the Black community. We need to find a way to develop the trust that needs to be established within community policing and communities actively caring for each other. And one of the best organizations that I know of is Cure Violence. Of course, it was discovered by Dr. Gary Slutkin. Marcus McAllister has been talking to me now. And Marcus, let's come back home to America. What are your concerns as you look out and you see what's happening in Rochester and Kenosha and Portland, where violence is still erupting within those peaceful protests? You've got factions on the left and on the right stepping in to cause violence rather than help bring healing.
Yeah, it's a lot of opportunist situations going on every spectrum. And so you have people that are going to take advantage of opportunities, take advantage of situations. And that goes for everybody. There's no one particular group I'm talking about. I'm saying when you have these situations, I'm not far from Kenosha, and the young man that was killed in the Kenosha shooting, I know his uncle real well.
You mean injured? Yeah.
When injured, I'm sorry. Yes, that was injured and paralyzed. I know his uncle real well. I know his family just a little, but I know his uncle very well. And so that was so close to me. I'm probably, even though I'm in Illinois, I'm in the northern suburb of Illinois, and I'm now probably 15 minutes from Kenosha. Like I could probably be in Kenosha in 15, 20 minutes max. And so when I think about these things are affecting everyone. I mean, they're affecting the staffs, the teams, the work. I mean, because it's just such a volatile situation that keeps happening over and over and over again. And it makes it rough on anyone trying to be about peace when you have so much chaos going on and all the things that are happening. And that start from the first situation, whatever it may be that led to more and the protests and all those type of things, they come with the territory. And so there's no way I can say that those things have helped. They've definitely made it a little harder on the environment that we're trying to work in, but we're prepared for it because this is what we've been dealing with, outbreaks. outbreak, spread of violence, people being angry and being able to, the world understands our terminology even more so now. I'm the type of person, I like to look at the positive and the negative. If there's one good thing that's come out of this is that people understand now, even when we say violence is an epidemic, it spreads from one person to the next. One event causes another event that causes another event. And so you look at the pandemic and the stuff that's going on with contract tracing. Think about contract tracing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when an area is infected and they want to trace back to who else that they might have infected, et cetera. It's the same thing the interrupters are doing in cities and have been doing, is that when someone gets shot or a situation occurs, they have to go back and who started this situation? What's the root cause of this shooting, and where did it happen? Was it a fight that happened 2 weeks ago at a club? Was it about a debt that was 3 weeks ago? That's contract tracing in the sense of violence. You have to get to the root of it so you can try to stop it from spreading and getting worse and worse.
When we return, I'll let you have the final word and your message to America. So welcome back. I've been talking to Marcus McAllister, a man that I've known for a number of years now. And this is our first time actually meeting in a setting like this where we can actually conduct an interview about the heroic work that he does, the courageous work that he, along with so many other members of Cure Violence. And Marcus, you know, you put your past behind you. Just yesterday, I had a gentleman on who had spent 10 years in jail for armed robbery. And the guy who arrested him, the FBI agent, they're now best of friends. And he launched Hope for Prisoners. So that campaign is working. And then your campaign, Cure Violence, you spent time in prison. It helps you understand what people go through to get there in the first place. But then you come out and you change and you start making changes in your community. And for that, I commend you. And I commend the other violence interrupters who are out there, because we need to hear from men and women like you. Based on all of that and all that's going on in our country and in our world, what's your message to the world today, particularly America, which is embroiled in so much racial hostility? How do we quell the violence, and how do we heal?
Yeah, well, I would say to the country, America specifically, and people in general, is that we have to put out more good vibes than we do bad vibes. We have to be careful about what we transfer to other people. It is so easy to infect people with your thoughts, your anger, what you're mad about, and whatever it may be. It's so easy, and it's so infectious. And so if you are someone who is going to protest certain things or be about certain things, be careful about how you put that out there in the atmosphere. And so I would want more people to try to put as much positivity in the atmosphere, because that also can be infectious. And we have a saying with Cure Violence, like, you have influence, use it. Use your influence for good, to be able to direct someone in the right way. To realize that you have influence with certain people. That goes for fathers, mothers, uncles, other big homies, people that are not doing Cure Violence. It really starts with opening your mouth, showing that you care, and being able to talk to someone with love. You know, love conquers all, that's for sure. And if you lead with love, and if you have a loving spirit, even when the chaos is going on, I mean, I hate to be so religious, but Paul said, I think myself happy when he was in jail, just because the person that was interviewing him in jail, he thought that person would understand him a little more. And he told himself he was happy, even though much more things were about to come about him while he was in jail. And so I would just say, people, to think yourself happy. I mean, in the midst of the chaos, because the devil doesn't like that. He doesn't like when you can think positivity and know that we can bring about peace, that this can be done. We can have a better country, a better America. You have to just speak it into existence. So that would be my advice to people. Speak it into existence, and know that you have influence and you can do the right thing, whether you work for Cure Violence or not, to be able to talk somebody down or direct them in a way that's not going to compound anger and behavior and be that contagion that we're trying to put out.
Marcus McAllister, violence interrupter of Cure Violence Global. And by the way, Cure Violence is hiring. So if you want to check out what Marcus does, if it intrigues you and is something that you'd like to do to actually get involved and engage in trying to change your community and stop the violence, make sure you check out Marcus and reach out to Cure Violence. What is it, cureviolence.org?
Yes, yeah. www.cvg.org. So that's for cureviolenceglobal.org. And go to our YouTube. Well, I always encourage people to go to YouTube and put in Cure Violence. You'll see documentaries and stories and different things that'll bring it to life that we've been able to put on our YouTube page and at Cure Violence as far as Twitter. But thank you for having me, Kelly. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I'm honored to have you, man, and keep doing the great work. You know, my prayers are with all of you because what you're doing is not easy. You make it look easy, but I know it's not easy when you're going into tough situations. And I pray for your safety as well as all of the members of Cure Violence. And don't ever apologize for sharing your faith on this show. You're always welcome to do that. It's just that way. So appreciate you, man. Keep stirring up some good trouble by having faith over fear. Marcus McAllister. We're back with my final word after this. And welcome back to the program. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling mighty inspired based on what our guests have said here today. I want to thank each and every one of them for being on the program. And I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to watch. I appreciate each and every one of you. And my final thoughts are these. It was Dr. King, if I can paraphrase him, who stated, faith is taking that first step, even though you can't see the staircase. And you know, when we learn to love each other and stand up for each other, it means that we must not be silent because our lives matter. And truly, you do. So therefore, let not your heart be troubled. Because as I stated before, I'm so glad trouble don't last always. We will get through this, standing together and, in many cases, praying together. Hopefully you've been righted, ignited, and united to keep spreading not fear, not racism, but love, freedom, and peace. God bless. Good night.
The rhythm of love is easy to find if you're listening. The color of light isn't red, black, or white, but it's crimson. We all bleed the same. If you don't feel the groove, it's all right. Just give it time, give it time. Come on, y'all. Get on board. Mankind won't survive if our hearts beat inside a hateful rhythm. You see, love isn't bought, but comes with a price of forgiveness, and we all bleed the same. Yeah. If you don't feel it now, just wait. It's coming on, the love train. Just give it time, give it time. Get on board. That means you and you.